She had always been the ghost in the office, the one whose emails went unanswered and whose presence was invisible to every eye until today. Today, in the hum of the morning chaos, her quiet routine collided with the storm that was him. He walked in, sharp suit, sharper gaze, and for the first time, her heart pounded because someone had actually seen her. Just a flicker, a brief lift of his piercing blue eyes that made her feel like the air around her had changed, like the world had split in two, before him and after. The office erupted in controlled chaos as morning meetings collided with urgent emails. She navigated it all like a ghost, unnoticed yet present, sorting mistakes and answering queries no one else would touch. And somewhere across the polished floor he lingered, his eyes subtly following her, curiosity sparking in the storm of his authority. A brief moment in the elevator, he pressed the button for the top floor, and she froze, a whisper of recognition in his gaze. His presence was magnetic, oppressive even. And yet, there was a flicker of something softer, something curious that made her pulse stutter. For a second, she wondered if he really saw her, or only the outline of a paper-strewn assistant. Vivian approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, assessing Amelia like prey. "You've been working late again?" she said, the words sharp, testing. But Amelia held her ground, the smallest spark of defiance igniting. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just invisible. She could be seen, and maybe even matter. Late evening, empty office. Kane's invitation came like a lightning bolt, brief and commanding. "Join me in my office." Amelia's breath caught. This was no casual summons. The elevator doors closed behind her as she ascended, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Invisible no more, she stepped into the eye of the storm. The office was quiet. The hum of machines, the only witness as he leaned against the polished mahogany of his office, studying her from across the room. She felt exposed, yet oddly protected as he asked questions that were more than professional, probing her thoughts, her opinions, her dreams. The barrier between boss and assistant wavered, and for the first time Amelia sensed a dangerous curiosity in his gaze. A challenge and an invitation all at once. She hadn't noticed him following her routine, silent and calculating, until she caught him staring during a fleeting moment by the water cooler. She spilled a small stack of papers in embarrassment, expecting ridicule, but instead he stepped forward, offering a hand, his fingers brushing hers. That brief contact sent a jolt through her, and she realized the invisible walls she'd built weren't as solid as she believed. In the quiet corners of the office lounge, she began to notice the subtle traces of his attention. The way his gaze lingered on her presentations, the way he remembered details no one else cared about. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became fascination. She had always thought herself unseen, but with him, she was both spotlight and shadow, caught in a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. Whispers spread through the office like wildfire. Rumors, glances, subtle smirks. Her coworkers noticed the shift before she did. Vivian's eyes narrowed as Amelia's quiet confidence grew, a dangerous spark igniting in the tension between them. Every glance from him felt like an electric current. Every whispered word from Vivian, a test she had to survive. Visibility was intoxicating and terrifying. Late night, the city lights spilling across the office floor, and he finally invited her to a private conversation. Close enough to see the faint flicker of emotion in his eyes, far enough to keep the air charged with restraint. Words flowed, confessions disguised as corporate strategy, curiosity entwined with admiration. By the time the elevator doors closed, Amelia's pulse had doubled, and she realized the invisible thread between them was no longer a secret. The ambush arrived at noon with the precision of a board agenda, a quick alignment that became a tribunal. Questions curved like knives, slides weaponized to make her look reckless for recommending a pivot no one dared voice aloud. She held her ground, throat dry, pulse a hammer, refusing to shrink as polite smiles hid sharpened teeth. When the numbers were twisted, she untwisted them. When motive was implied, she answered with outcomes. When silence pressed in, she spoke into it, steady and clear, until the room felt different, less like a cage, more like a stage. Across the table he watched without rescue, the cool patience of someone measuring not just what she knew, but who she was under heat. When the meeting broke, she left with nothing but her breath, and the subtle certainty that invisible people don't survive fires. Only visible ones do. He called her back with a single sentence that wasn't a compliment so much as a dare. In the quiet after the storm, he stripped the proposal to its bones and asked what everyone else was afraid to ask. If the risk was worth the blood it would draw. She didn't flinch. She traced the arc from failure to possibility, threading through worst cases as if they were beads on a string, turning each one until it caught the light. He pressed harder. She pressed back, matching pace, breath for breath, idea for idea, until the air between them felt thin and bright. In the glass reflection, she caught the shape of herself. Steadier, taller, and the faintest quirk at the corner of his mouth. Not approval exactly, but recognition. When the door opened and the world rushed in, neither said victory, yet both understood the ground had shifted under their feet. Word spread as it always does, carried by the elevator cables and the hiss of espresso steam. She had held her own, and he had let her. The floor rearranged around that rumor, chairs swiveling to face her when she spoke, whispers dimming as she passed. He kept his distance, but not his attention. She felt it like a pulse, an aftersound in a quiet room. When a snag threatened the rollout, she volunteered first, not out of bravado but clarity, and discovered the strangest thing. Fear obeyed her when she named it. By evening, their exchanges had become a rhythm of glances and spare words, a language without excess. She walked to the elevator with a new weight in her step, not burden but gravity, and caught a reflection of him at the corridor's end. Still, watchful, as if memorizing the silhouette of someone he hadn't planned on meeting. Night returned like a secret. They worked side by side with the city glittering beneath them, trading hypotheses and corrections, the room warmed by the low hum of machines and the untidy honesty that only fatigue permits. He revealed the map of the market as if it were a coastline had sailed alone for years. She sketched new routes through reefs Hyde learned to avoid. When their fingers brushed over the same chart, neither withdrew. The pause that followed was not clumsy but carved, a deliberate space in which the unsaid could breathe. She laughed once, low and surprised at herself. He looked up as if the sound were a confession. The solution arrived all at once, so elegant it felt like a kiss they didn't quite dare. They sealed it with nothing more than a nod. Yet the air carried the heat of a promise neither would name. The elevator let her out to a silence that felt curated. On his credenza, half hidden beneath a contract, lay a dossier with a name that recurred like a bruise across the company's history, a failed acquisition that had turned ruthless and personal. She shouldn't have read the headline, shouldn't have seen the deposition photo, the hollowed eyes that explained the way he built his walls. Swiftly, high, without apology. The door clicked, footsteps approached. She put the papers back, hands unsteady, suddenly aware that wanting someone is different from knowing how they were made. When he stepped in, the room smelled of rain and ink. He looked at her as if measuring what she had learned, and the distance between them widened, not absence, but a ravine carved by truth. She met his gaze without retreat, a promise to ask the question later, when both could survive the answer. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, its ink raised like a heartbeat under her thumb, promising crystal light and decisive smiles. She rehearsed reasons to decline, each one dissolving beneath the sense that refusing would keep her small and unseen. By dusk, the city unfurled like a jeweled ribbon, and the car's quiet carried her toward a room that had never asked for her, yet suddenly expected proof she belonged. He waited at the entrance, composed as a verdict, offering his arm not as rescue but as recognition. Cameras winked, whispers braided themselves into a rope she could climb or be strangled by. Inside, strategy wore champagne. Wealth disguised itself as charm, and she understood the test. Walk the edges without cutting herself, speak without trembling, and show that the mind he'd noticed could glitter as hard as any diamond in the room. He introduced her without qualifiers, a quiet elevation that turned small talk into inquiry. The powerful leaned closer, expecting gloss, and received steel wrapped in velvet. She answered questions as if placing chess pieces, measured, surprising, while he hovered at the radius of her courage, intervening only when a smile needed sharpening. The music softened into something sinuous, and their orbit tightened. A turn on the dance floor that felt like a negotiation. A joke at the bar that tasted like confession. The room blurred at its edges as her presence focused, and she felt the gravity of being chosen, not displayed. Yet every compliment carried a filament of danger, each glance threading a pattern only they could read. When a partner from an old deal prodded for gossip, she redirected the blade with a gentle wrist, and he watched with the satisfied silence of a door unlocking from within. Between speeches, she escaped to the gallery of winter-white corridors, where portraits of strangers appraised her with centuries of certainty. He found her there, not to claim but to listen. And the words came out before she could varnish them. The years of learning to apologize for taking up space, the brittle posture of competence that hid a soft ache for substance. He didn't fix or flatter. He offered a story in return. Loss pressed into ambition until it became a blade he learned to hold by the hilt. The quiet felt like shelter, and she understood why the world mistook his restraint for cold. The furnace ran inward, illuminating only those who dared stand close. When applause swelled from the ballroom, neither rushed to rejoin it. The doorway framed them like a question only honesty could answer, and in that pause their loyalties rewrote themselves, subtle as breath on glass. The return to the crowd felt like stepping into a current that had noticed their absence. He moved to confer with a cluster of investors. She accepted a conversation with a smile that frayed as a familiar voice slid in beside her, oiled with courtesy. The questions were flint striking steel. How quickly she'd risen, how precarious the view must be. She parried until the angle turned personal, and the blade nicked skin. Heat climbed her throat. She steadied it with a swallow of air, and a single measured sentence that put the floor back under her feet. Across the room, he clocked the shift. Across the rim of her glass, she saw him start toward her. But she had already rebuilt the bridge. And when the moment passed, she caught the glint of thwarted satisfaction in eyes that wanted to fall more than a lesson. The music swelled, triumphant and brittle as crystal. Midnight hushed the party to velvet, and the terrace opened like a secret. Wet stone, cold breath, the city's red arteries threading the dark. She stepped outside to cool the heat of scrutiny. He followed, distance enough to honor, nearness enough to risk. The air between them tasted of rain and unasked promises. Words found them as if they had been waiting on the ledge. Not declarations, but acknowledgments, two histories folding along a shared crease. When he reached for her, it wasn't possession. It was surrender to something already written in the room they'd just left, in the dossier she hadn't unlearned, in the way survival had made them both exacting. The kiss almost didn't happen, and then it did. Brief, breathless, the spark of a match that could light a skyline. They parted a fraction, foreheads close, and chose silence over spectacle before returning to the noise. The clue arrived disguised as routine, a spreadsheet uploaded to the wrong folder, columns that repeated like a stutter, numbers aligned too neatly to be true. She traced the pattern through archived memos and midnight emails, finding the ghost of a shell company walking alongside legitimate contracts, siphoning value with every step. The realization tasted metallic, like biting a coin. Old, cold, undeniable. Each click drew her deeper. Code names masquerading as vendor aliases, signatures that weren't quite themselves, a sequence of approvals administered in the precise windows when oversight slept. The ache behind her eyes grew until it pulsed, but stopping felt like betrayal of everyone who believed the floor was solid. When she reached the end of the thread, it looped back toward the corner office, and the man whose gaze had taught her to stand taller. Truth didn't choose sides. It waited to see who would. He summoned her without warmth, a morning brittle enough to cut skin. The questions came measured, clinical. How far she had looked, what she believed she'd found, whether she understood the cost of dragging shadows into daylight. She answered with the steadiness she'd forged in earlier fires, laying the pattern bare without accusing his hands of drawing it. His silence was a corridor with no doors. When he finally spoke, it was a test wrapped as protocol. Deliver a sealed file to an external auditor he named. No copies. No trace. She recognized the razor's edge, obedience or integrity, both risky and both revealing. She accepted the task without ceremony and left with her heart a drum against bone, wondering whether she had been entrusted with a safeguard or bait. Either way, a line had been drawn, and she was walking it. The elevator stalled briefly between floors, a hiccup that felt like omen. When the doors parted in the lobby, a familiar smile waited, sweet as glass candy, sharp as the shards beneath. Casual questions disguised their blade well. Where she was headed, why the envelope, whether the auditor's name rang a bell. She sidestepped with courtesy until the path narrowed to a corner of polished stone where politeness could not protect her. The insinuations arrived with perfect diction, painting her as overeager, naive, easily led into corridors where reputations were made and bled. She held her breath, counted to 3, and replied with a single clear sentence that recognized the trap and refused it. The smile tightened, the air cooled. The parting words were velvet over wire. A warning, a wager, a promise that invisibility was safer than ascension. She kept walking. She did not look back. By afternoon, whispers detonated like timed charges. Leaked snippets, misquoted threads, her name braided with the word ambitious, until it sounded like accusation. Meeting. Invites vanished. Calendars reshuffled without her. Files she needed blinked into permissions she no longer held. She understood the choreography. Make the target doubt her footing, then push. The shove came as a compliance review convened in a room too small for its purpose, faces arranged in a semicircle of reasonable concern. Questions multiplied, each structured to turn prudence into presumption. She answered until breath thinned, then stopped answering and began asking, sliding printouts across the table, forcing eyes to travel the path she had walked. The semicircle faltered, the door opened. A new presence changed the temperature of the air, and for a beat, everything held, like glass deciding whether to shatter. The storm broke not with raised voices, but with decisions. He crossed the room, set down a keycard, and authorized system-wide access to the audit trail, in full view of those who would prefer darkness. What followed was merciless clarity, timestamps assembling into a spine, approvals aligning like vertebrae, the shell company's shadow stepping into shape. The trap that had been baited with her fear snapped shut on different prey. In the scramble that followed, roles inverted. The whisperers whisperless, the hunters blinking under light. He stood beside her, not shielding, but bracing the door against the old habit of secrecy. When the last page printed and the room exhaled, she swayed. Exhaustion, release, the tremor after impact. He steadied her with a touch that said nothing and everything. Outside, the day looked exactly the same. Inside, the ground had moved. Morning came with the chill of consequences, and the office wore its quiet like armor, She entered his world without the cushion of pretense, the dossier in her memory, and the night's triumph still hot in her bones. He closed the door and let silence do what words could not, admit there were debts owed to truth. She spoke first, not accusing but insisting, on context, on transparency, on the line between ruthlessness and rot. He listened the way a cliff listens to the sea, immovable yet eroded by persistence, his composure threaded with something raw. What he had protected made sense when you measured it against loss. What he had ignored did not. She did not retreat. He did not deflect. The conversation walked the edge of a blade and did not slip, and when it ended, neither was absolved, but both were altered, less polished, more real. Cut with light that could not be unlearned. He asked her to walk, and the city complied, streets rinsed by last night's rain, reflections trembling in the gutters as if secrets were learning to breathe. In motion, he told the story he rarely permitted air. The first deal that carved him, the partner who turned the knife, the vow he made to build a fortress that even grief could not scale. The confession arrived without spectacle, a ledger balanced between pride and regret. She heard not a defense but a blueprint, and she folded her own past into it. Years of shrinking to survive, the way invisibility can feel like safety until it becomes a cage. Their truths met like trains at a junction and shuddered, then aligned on a new track. Neither could have laid alone. By the time they looped back toward the tower, the distance between them was not absence but path, a road they had already begun to share. Back inside, the machinery of consequence ground forward, precise and hungry. She drew a bright circle around her own terms. No meetings without her when her name was at stake, no edits to her findings, no romance without equal footing. The last demand hung in the air with more weight than the others, an agreement whose currency was respect. He nodded once, a contract and a gesture. She signed it with action, carving a plan that protected whistleblowers, codified transparency, and locked the company's ribs in policies that would hold through future storms. When resistance stiffened, she answered with function over theater, delivering solutions faster than doubt could grow. In a quiet moment, they laughed. Short, disbelieving, almost tender, at the absurdity of building trust with the same hands that had learned to hide. The laugh didn't fix anything. It made fixing possible. News does not walk. It flies. By afternoon, the market's breath turned shallow as a headline sliced through the noise. An investigation. A shell company. A promise to cooperate that read like a confession to some and a power play to others. Phones vibrated like trapped bees. Investors demanded reassurance. Rivals smirked in polite statements. Employees searched for the part that concerned them. She stood before the cameras because the truth required a face not sharpened by habit. The speech she gave refused both panic and spin. Facts first, accountability second, intent braided to process so tightly that theatrics could not pry them apart. He watched from the wings, radio silent but present, the calculus in his eyes revised by something steadier than strategy. When she finished, the room did not cheer. It steadied. Sometimes survival sounds like that. A collective exhale that makes room for the next breath. At dusk, with the building thinning to bone and window lights blooming like a constellation, the final play assembled itself. She proposed a clean cut. Terminate the compromised contracts, refer findings to regulators, elevate internal auditors beyond the reach of anyone's ego. He added teeth. Clawbacks, board oversight, a public timeline that tied their names to deadlines instead of rumors. Resistance flared and faded when confronted with the inevitability of daylight. In the quiet that followed, they stood in the doorway of his office and tasted what they had not dared name. Not victory, but alignment. A geometry that held without strain. He reached for her hand, not to lead, but to match step. And for a moment, the city felt less like a battlefield and more like terrain. Tomorrow would bring fresh weather, new knives, unanswered questions. Tonight, They had a compass. That was enough to carry them forward. Morning rose clean and clinical, the kind of light that leaves no corners to hide in. She stood at the head of the table, not because someone invited her, but because the work she'd carved now required a voice to carry it. Slides were not decoration. They were scaffolds, and she climbed them with unhurried certainty, outlining the cut lines, the guardrails, the places where power would finally meet consequence. Questions arrived like pebbles testing a bridge. Each one found footing. The room adjusted its posture by degrees as authority shifted from assumption to proof. She remembered the ache of invisibility, the way it had taught her to fold herself small, and felt something loosen, an old knot slipping free. No one applauded. They adopted the plan. They scheduled the next steps. They made the future practical. She left with a steady pulse and the quiet astonishment of someone who can no longer vanish, even if she tried. The corridor felt longer than usual, a tunnel of frosted light and murmuring praise she refused to pocket. He waited near the threshold of the day. Sleeves rolled, guarded elegance stripped down to something human. There was no spectacle, only candor. Acknowledgement given publicly and without embroidery. Credit placed precisely where the architecture demanded it. For once, admiration did not arrive like a spotlight, scorching and isolating. It moved through her, like warmth, absorbed instead of blinding. He asked nothing in return, and that restraint turned the ground under them from volatile to firm. She met it with a nod that contained the hours no one saw, the nights that tasted of ink and doubt, the courage to insist on equal footing. Somewhere beyond the glass, headlines shifted tone. Somewhere inside, a door unlatched without noise. Respect was the language. The translation read clearly in the ease with which they shared the silence. Evening returned with a hush and a view that felt like permission. High above the city, the plants kept their own small weather, leaf shadows trembling on glass as if the world could be gentler when witnessed from here. They spoke in the register that follows storms. Low, honest, practical enough to hold feeling without breaking it. Promises were not fireworks. They were architecture, measurable and durable. Truth first, consent always, power shared, pace chosen together. He offered history without armor. She offered grace without surrender. When they reached for each other, it was not the reach of hunger, but recognition, a seal placed on something already living between them. The kiss arrived unrushed, anchored by quiet breath, and the relief of arriving where intention had been leading all along. Outside, the city kept flashing its hard alphabet. Inside, the vocabulary softened into a language that both already knew. By week's end, the organization learned a new rhythm. Policies slid from draft to doctrine. Oversight shifted from performance to muscle. The mess did not vanish. It was managed with spine. In a conference where outcomes were tallied, those who had played at fog found themselves cataloged by sunlight. Reassignments, training, accountability that bit without drawing spectacle. She did not gloat, and he did not let anyone mistake order for vengeance. The room absorbed the lesson. Culture is a ledger written daily, not a plaque hung once. When the final signatures dried, the hum that rose wasn't triumph but coherence, the sound of an engine that finally fits its parts. She stepped outside the room and leaned her head briefly against cool glass, feeling the old fear tap once at the door, before wandering off, bored by its lack of purchase. What remained was steadiness, and the kind of quiet that stays. The city cracked open into morning, crisp and honest, the kind that makes glass look like water. She walked through the lobby without shrinking, carrying nothing heavier than her own name. Faces turned not with curiosity but recognition. Doors opened because work had taught them to. At the curb, the day lifted its shoulders and waited. She thought of the first glance that had rearranged her gravity, of the many rooms where silence had once felt safer than speech, and understood the simplest victory. She could not disappear now, not from them, not from herself. A car eased to the edge of the frame. A hand reached, not to guide, but to meet. She took it with a smile too small for cameras, perfectly sized for truth. The future did not fanfare. It unfolded, clear as breath in cold air, visible at last and entirely, beautifully hers.